It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day where nothing feels out of place. I was working in the garage, grease on my hands, music humming in the background, when the sound of heavy fists pounding on our front door echoed through the house. It wasn't the casual knock of a neighbor, or even the firm rattle of a delivery driver. This knock was loud, authoritative, and repeated with a kind of aggression that carried through the walls. My wife, Emily, stepped out of the kitchen with her coffee mug in hand and frowned. She opened the door, and standing there was Karen, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer of all HOA laws, clipboard clutched tight. Her lips curled into a smirk that promised trouble. Without even a greeting, Karen barked, "You're not supposed to live here. I've already called the cops. You and your husband are going to be evicted today." At first, Emily thought it was some kind of mistake. She asked Karen calmly what she was talking about, but Karen only leaned in closer, eyes narrowed, as if daring her to challenge the nonsense she was spewing. "Don't play dumb," Karen hissed. "This neighborhood doesn't allow renters, and I know you're not on the deed. Your husband is the owner, and you're just squatting here." The words were dripping with venom, a carefully chosen insult designed to degrade. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. She had been through this dance before with petty, power-hungry people. Karen, emboldened by Emily's silence, continued her tirade. "You think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and ignore the rules? Not on my watch. I've already called the police, and when they get here, you better have your bags packed." She clicked her pen as if she were signing off on someone's life, smug in the belief that she was untouchable. Not 20 minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights reflected off the windows of our house. A squad car pulled up in front of the driveway, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. Karen practically sprinted toward them, her clipboard waving in the air like a flag of victory. She pointed at our house, shouting loud enough for the entire block to hear, "That woman is trespassing. She doesn't belong here. Arrest her and get her out of my neighborhood." The officers tried to calm her down, but Karen wouldn't stop. She jabbed her finger toward Emily, who had now stepped outside onto the porch with her coffee mug still in hand, completely unbothered. Neighbors peeked out of their blinds and stood on porches, curious about the unfolding spectacle. Karen thought she was about to become the hero of the HOA, the woman who cleansed the neighborhood of its supposed offenders. What she didn't realize was that she was walking straight into her own humiliation. Emily finally set her coffee down on the porch railing and walked toward the officers with a calm confidence that made even Karen hesitate. One of the officers asked for her name, and when Emily provided it, both men exchanged a quick glance. Karen, not noticing their reaction, continued ranting. "Don't just stand there. She's not supposed to be here. Kick her out." But instead of following Karen's orders, one of the officers suddenly straightened his posture and nodded at Emily with a tone of respect. "Captain Reynolds," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." Karen froze, her smirk evaporating into confusion. Emily looked at her coolly and finally spoke. "You called the cops on me?" Her voice was sharp but steady, laced with authority that only years of commanding respect could carry. The officers shifted uneasily, clearly aware of the power dynamic that had just flipped. Karen's face went pale as Emily added, "For your information, I don't just live here legally. I run the state police force." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's smug grin was gone, replaced by wide eyes and trembling lips. She stumbled over her words, desperately trying to backtrack. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. "I was just trying to enforce the HOA rules. I didn't know." But Emily cut her off with a raised hand, the same commanding gesture she used in briefing rooms filled with officers. "You called the police under false pretenses, harassed me at my own home, and tried to weaponize authority you don't have," Emily said coldly. "That's not just a mistake, that's abuse." Karen opened her mouth again, but nothing came out except a nervous squeak. The neighbors watching from their porches were whispering now, and several even had their phones out, recording the entire ordeal. Karen's kingdom of control was crumbling, and everyone was witnessing it. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, addressed Emily with respect. "Captain, would you like us to handle the situation?" one asked, giving Karen a look that suggested she had made a grave mistake. Emily shook her head slowly. "No, I'll handle this one myself." She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and Karen, who backed up nervously toward the sidewalk. "Let me make something clear," Emily said, her voice low but carrying enough weight for the crowd to hear. "This is my home. I pay the mortgage. I live here with my husband. And if you ever harass me or my family again, I won't just file a complaint with the HOA. I'll make sure you answer to the law you tried to twist today." Karen's knees nearly buckled as the reality sank in. Her attempt to oust Emily had not only failed, it had publicly exposed her as a liar and a bully. The crowd of neighbors didn't hold back their reactions. A few even clapped, while others openly laughed at Karen's downfall. One neighbor shouted, "Guess you messed with the wrong person this time, Karen." Another added, "About time someone put her in her place." Karen's face flushed deep red as she realized she had lost whatever shred of authority she thought she had. The officers excused themselves respectfully, clearly eager to leave the circus behind. Emily turned and walked back toward the house, her composure unshaken, as Karen stood frozen in the middle of the street, her clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. She had wanted to make an example of Emily, but instead, she had become the example, the cautionary tale of what happens when arrogance collides with real power. That night, the story spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Everyone knew what Karen had tried to pull, and everyone knew how badly it had backfired. No one feared her anymore. In fact, people began openly challenging her ridiculous HOA notices and demanding actual accountability from the board. Karen stopped showing up at meetings for weeks, humiliated into silence. As for Emily, she never once bragged or gloated. She simply went on living her life, sipping coffee on the porch like nothing had ever happened. But everyone who had been there that day remembered it. The morning when HOA Karen thought she had all the power, only to discover she had tangled with the one person she never should have underestimated. And here's the truth that stuck with me. Power isn't about clipboards, titles, or rules scribbled on paper. It's about integrity, respect, and knowing when to stand your ground. Karen tried to use borrowed authority to scare us, but Emily carried the real thing, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted or enforced with threats. It was written in her voice, her presence, and the unshakable calm that turned an ambush into a lesson. To this day, when I see Karen slinking around the neighborhood, avoiding eye contact, I'm reminded of that lesson. Never underestimate the quiet strength of the person you're trying to tear down, because sometimes the one you target isn't just your neighbor. They're the force that keeps the whole state in line. After that day, Karen's presence in the neighborhood changed dramatically. Once, she was the loudest voice in every meeting, the first to send out notices, and the quickest to knock on doors with her clipboard in hand. But now she was silent. She walked with her head down, moving quickly from her driveway to her car, as though she could outrun the whispers that followed her. The same neighbors who once trembled when she spoke now openly ignored her, brushing past her as if she were invisible. It was strange, almost eerie, to see someone who once thrived on fear, now swallowed by it. But what struck me most was how fragile her authority really had been. One encounter with the wrong target had shattered her entire facade. A few weeks later, the HOA board held one of their routine meetings. Normally, Karen would have been front and center, leading the charge, wagging her finger at anyone who dared to oppose her. But this time, she was quiet, sitting in the back row with her clipboard tucked under her chair like a forgotten relic. People spoke freely, raising issues that Karen would have normally shut down, A neighbor brought up the unnecessary fines. Another complained about the arbitrary rules. And for the first time, the board actually listened. When Emily and I walked into the room, the entire atmosphere shifted. Whispers spread, and all eyes turned toward my wife, the very woman Karen had tried to humiliate. Even the board members nodded respectfully, their usual smugness replaced with something closer to caution. Karen kept her head down, never daring to make eye contact with Emily, as though looking at her would reignite the fire she had already. By the end of that meeting, a decision was made that stunned the entire neighborhood. The HOA announced that several of its policies would be reviewed, rewritten, or completely abolished. The ridiculous restrictions on parking, the petty fines for harmless decorations, even the rule about renters that Karen had tried to use against us. All of it was being stripped down. The board claimed it was about modernizing, but everyone knew the truth. They were scared. They had seen what happened when one of their enforcers went too far, and they didn't want to suffer the same fate. As people applauded the changes, Karen sat frozen, clutching her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The same tool she had used as a weapon was now nothing more than dead weight, a reminder of the empire she had lost. After the meeting ended, Karen finally worked up the courage to approach Emily. Her voice trembled as she spoke, no longer sharp or commanding, but weak, almost pleading. I just didn't know who you were," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I was only trying to follow the rules." Emily looked at her with steady eyes, the same calm strength she had carried on the day of the confrontation. "It's not about who I am," Emily replied. "It's about who you chose to be. You didn't call the police because of the rules. You did it because you wanted control. You wanted fear. And now you've lost both." Karen's lip quivered, and for a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered the humiliation she had tried to bring to my wife, and pity quickly turned into satisfaction. From that moment on, the power dynamics in the neighborhood shifted entirely. Karen no longer knocked on doors or shoved violation notices into mailboxes. She became a ghost of the person she once was, a reminder of what unchecked arrogance could do. In contrast, Emily became a quiet force of respect in the community. She never flaunted her position, never reminded people of her authority. But neighbors trusted her, asked her opinion, and even sought her guidance when issues arose. It wasn't official power, but it was the kind that mattered, the kind that came from respect rather than fear. Every barbecue, every holiday gathering, every casual chat on the sidewalk carried the same unspoken truth. Karen had lost, and Emily had won, not through shouting or threats, but through dignity and unshakable presence. Time passed, but the memory of that day never faded. People still whispered about it when new families moved into the neighborhood. "Did you hear what happened with Karen and the captain?" they would say, almost like passing down a legend. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that authority only works when it's backed by truth and integrity. Karen remained in the neighborhood, but she was no longer feared, no longer respected, just tolerated. And every time she glanced at our house, every time she saw Emily standing on the porch sipping her coffee, she was reminded of the day she lost everything. It was a loss she could never undo, because it wasn't just about rules or fines. It was about respect, and that once lost never returns. And so, here's what I've carried with me ever since. True strength is quiet, steady, and unshakable. It doesn't need sirens or titles or uniforms to prove itself. It's in the way Emily stood calm while Karen raged, the way she didn't flinch when the police arrived, and the way she didn't need to raise her voice to put Karen in her place. That day taught me that some people only understand power when it's loud, but real power whispers, it doesn't scream. Karen tried to weaponize rules and fear, but Emily embodied the kind of authority that outlasts fear, the kind that leaves an imprint long after the shouting stops. And every time I see Karen hurry past our house, eyes on the ground, I'm reminded of that truth. The HOA tried to evict my wife. Instead, my wife evicted their fear. Months later, just when it seemed Karen had finally faded into obscurity, she made one last desperate attempt to reclaim her grip on the neighborhood. A letter arrived in everyone's mailbox, an official-looking notice stamped with the HOA seal. It claimed new emergency rules were being enacted to restore order, rules that were harsher than anything before, restrictions on guests, curfews for outdoor activities, even limits on how many cars could be parked in a driveway. It was Karen's old voice written on new paper, clawing at the scraps of power she had left. But this time, something remarkable happened. Instead of fear, the neighborhood responded with unity. Neighbors gathered in driveways and living rooms, sharing their anger, their frustration, and finally, their resolve. And at the center of it all stood Emily, not commanding, not ordering, but listening, guiding, and reminding everyone that they didn't have to live under fear anymore. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. The room was packed with neighbors, more than had ever attended, and their voices carried with strength. When Karen stood up to defend her so-called emergency rules, she found herself drowned out, not by shouts, but by the steady, collective refusal of an entire community. People held copies of her letter in the air like evidence in a trial, pointing out its absurdities, mocking its language, and stripping it of the authority she thought it carried. The board, sensing the tide had turned permanently, had no choice but to vote Karen out of her position. In that single moment, the woman who once lorded over us all was reduced to nothing more than a name in the minutes of a meeting. The clipboard she once wielded like a sword was now just plastic and paper, tossed aside as the room erupted in applause, not for Karen's downfall, but for the freedom they had reclaimed. With Karen gone, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Barbecues that had once been silent affairs grew into full gatherings, where laughter spilled into the streets. Kids played freely, their bikes and chalk drawings no longer targets for Karen's wrath. Families decorated their porches for the holidays, without fear of fines. The neighborhood became what it was always supposed to be, a place of community, not control. And though Emily never once sought recognition, the truth was undeniable. She had become the heartbeat of it all. People trusted her not because of her title, but because of her integrity. She had shown them what real leadership looked like, and it didn't come with threats or fear. It came with respect. Of course, Karen didn't disappear completely. She still lived in her house at the end of the cul-de-sac, though she rarely stepped outside. When she did, it was with her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, her presence shrinking as though she could fold herself into invisibility. Sometimes I would see her watching from behind her blinds, peering out at the very community she had once tried to control. There was no more shouting, no more lecturing, only silence. She had become her own prison, trapped not by walls, but by the consequences of her arrogance. And in that silence, I realized something. The greatest punishment for someone like Karen wasn't being yelled at, fined, or even officially removed. It was being forgotten, stripped of the attention and fear that once gave her power. And here's where I leave the story, because in the end, this wasn't just about a petty HOA rule or a clipboard warrior who thought she could bully her way into control. It was about something much larger. The difference between fear and respect, between borrowed authority and true leadership. My wife didn't win that day because she outranked Karen. She won because she didn't flinch. She stood her ground with dignity, with integrity, with the kind of quiet strength that lasts long after the shouting stops. Karen called the cops to evict my wife, but all she did was evict herself, from her position, from her influence, from the power she thought she had. And every time I sit on our porch beside Emily, watching the neighborhood laugh and live freely, I'm reminded of one simple truth. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to be raised at all.